Hello. Welcome to the episode of the Let People Prosper series. My name is Dr. Vance Gann. I hope you're having a prosperous day. Well, today I'm doing this solo, no guest or anything like that. I loved having interviews and having someone come on the show every week. But every once in a while, I want to take some time to kind of give you my views on the economy, some of the things that are going on. I try to share that, here and there through the discussions I have with interviews. But I think it's also important to kind of lay out how I see the economy and what's going on and some of the other things that I'm working on that you might be interested in as well, as we're all working together to find ways to let people prosper, right? And also I want to thank you all for listening to this show, either watching on YouTube, listening to it on whatever platform it is that you listen to your podcast on. But also, checking out my newsletter at vancegin.substack.com, where I have every once in a while, I'll send out newsletters about the latest of what's going on in the economy at the state level, at the federal level, and just some of the big ticket items that are happening each and every day. So that way we can make sure we stay up to date with what's going on and look at it from a free market perspective, because too often those free market perspectives are becoming too few as part of the overall process, as many people are wanting to get more government involved for solutions. And ultimately, the way that I see things is we already have too much government involvement in much of our economy, in the major sectors of our economy. If you think about healthcare, education, transportation, construction, a lot of these are dominated by government influence through regulations, through government spending, through taxes. And ultimately, those are ways that are going to contribute to more distortions, less economic growth, fewer jobs being created than otherwise, lower wages, higher prices, the things that really intrude on our lives each and every day. And so those are things that we all need to take into account and consider. And so I'm recording this on February 14th, Valentine's Day of 2023. It's a pleasure to have you here with me today. But again, check out vancegin.substack.com. Subscribe so you'll get these emails whenever I send them out, and along with these podcast episodes as well. I try to keep all those things going in a lot of different ways. It's been a lot of fun to get this started. Late last year, I relaunched all these episodes. So if you started back, last year listening to these, you might want to start back again from the number one as we went through and relaunched. We worked on editing on all of these. I had a great editor. She helped me out with these, and I think they sound a lot better. They've got good intros and everything else that you'll not only learn from the interviews that I had back then, but you'll also be able to hopefully share it with others so they can learn in the process. So there's always something to improve as we go forward. So with all of that, I think what I like to do is hit on three key topics today. One of those being the President Biden State of the Union speech just here recently, and kind of go through my thoughts on that. Then I also want to hit on the responsible budget revolution that we are really seeing across the state. And a lot of state think tanks are doing important work in that space. It's really an area that I've had a niche in, that I've really had some expertise and studied a lot over the years. And we talked about that a lot on this show, of the importance of spending limits. As Milton Friedman said, the real problem of government is how much it spends. That's the real ultimate burden. And so if we don't limit spending, then government will continue to infiltrate our lives, infiltrate our economy, and reduce jobs and all the other things that it does, and distorts the economic activity until we can limit government spending to its constitutional roles. Too much of what government doing is well outside of its constitutional roles. And we've got to make sure that it's limited. So the more that you can limit spending, the more that we can get them forced back into those constitutional roles. And so first thing, State of the Union speech. Second one, responsible, this budgeting revolution. And number three, I want to talk about some of the latest economic data that's been out here in the month of February, looking at the jobs report that came out earlier this month, and then the CPI data that was actually released today for inflation. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. And please stick with me as long as possible. Be great. Okay. So the president gave his State of the Union speech recently. And as you might expect, there was a lot of rosy scenarios about the economy. One of the things that he tweeted out on February 7th, which is the day of the State of the Union, was he said, "Our economic plan is breaking records." Then he had this infographic talking about the record-breaking Biden economy, two strongest calendar years of job growth in history, lowest unemployment rate in over 50 years, manufacturing rebounded the fastest rate in nearly 40 years, two strongest years of small business applications in history, record decrease in deficit, fastest gas price decline in 8 years, and annual inflation data down for 6 months. When you look at these, it sounds really good. It sounds like a robust economy with where people are just thriving and prospering all around us. And unfortunately, that's not what we're seeing. I mean, it's poll after poll, consumer sentiment measures and surveys that are out there. People are feeling the burden of higher prices. They're feeling the burden of not knowing if they're going to have a job very long, or if their wages will keep up with inflation. Their real wages continue to decline. And so I think when you look at this, it's important to break down what are some of the realities that's going on. So also on that day, I tweeted, I quote tweeted the president and said, "Look, records question mark." We have a 40-year high inflation rates. Even today's numbers for CPI was up 6.4% year over year. That's still near 40-year highs. So we're still along those lines. 22 months of declining year over year real earnings. So that's real average weekly earnings. So you look at the weekly earnings, so your entire week, how much you make, the average across the United States, and you can look at what the increase has been over time. You adjust that for inflation month over month on the annual basis of what they're looking at, and you say, okay, well, are real wages increasing or decreasing? If you don't know what real is, that just means inflation adjusted. That's what we use in economics, real average hourly earnings. And what you see is that it's been going down every month. And then just like today, when the inflation numbers came out, average hourly earnings were growing at a slower rate year over year than the inflation rate. So this is not a good sign for the economy. It's why many people feel like they're struggling when they go to get food and everything else, is that their wages just aren't keeping up. There was a weak increase in real GDP. And if you look at 2022, Q4 2022 over Q4 2021, which is, I think, the best measure to look at, not the annual averages of growth rates of real GDP, but that real GDP was only 1%. It only increased by 1% from Q4 2021 to Q4 2022, which was the slowest Q4 over Q4 increase since 2009, which is when we were coming out of the Great Recession. You would think it would have been a little bit more robust then, but it wasn't. But that was the slowest that we've had in a recovery period, excluding what I'm calling the shutdown recession, the 2020 recession during the shutdowns and the pandemic. I mean, of course, that was a substantial decline in economic activity and growth and everything else. But now we only had we had a very weak 1% growth in 2022 at a time when we should continue to be rebounding, right, from those doldrums of the shutdown recession. Another key part that's hurting a lot of Americans is that we have a 20-year high mortgage rate. That's come down a little bit as we were above 7% on average mortgage rates. I've seen it closer to 6.5% now, but that's still, multi-decade high of what the mortgage rates have been. It's nowhere near like the 1980s, the early 1980s. You could get a mortgage rate of close to 20%, right? So we're still well below that, but it's still putting more of a cost, an affordability issue for a lot of American families, and especially when home values are already going up. We have seen them start to come down from their peak on home values. They've been down from anywhere from 5 to 10% in some places. I think we're going to expect to see closer down to 15 to 20% before all this is done, because there's been an inflationary pressure for housing values to go up at a rapid rate, and those have got to come back down, back to earth. They were going up too high, too fast, and a lot of that has created affordability issues. Well, now, as you have higher values and you have higher interest rates, that means the monthly mortgage payments are also going to go up if you're getting a new home or you're refinancing or something like that. And so fewer people are doing that right now, which is going to also dampen demand for housing. And so this 20-year high mortgage rate is not a good sign for the Biden economy. He talks about, these record decrease in deficits. Well, he's still going to have $1 trillion in deficits that are fueling inflation, right? The deficit did go down from a little over $3 trillion in 2020 when you had the shutdown recession, the CARES Act, a lot of money that was being sent out at the same, and so that contributed to the deficit. 2021, they had some massive increases by the Biden administration and Democrats in Congress of the American Rescue Plan Act, a couple of other bills that were passed during that year. So the federal government still ran a $2.8 trillion deficit, just so that's the annual deficit. And then you had 2022, the latest year, that increase in the deficit was 1.4 trillion. So it's still massive. It's still more than $1 trillion, but it was cut in half if you just look at the overall number from 2.8 trillion to 1.4. But that was in despite of what President Biden wanted to do. He was wanting to increase government spending even more, right? And some of the increases that they passed, like the Jobs Act, the infrastructure bill that was passed, the CHIPS Act, these were massive hundreds of billions, $1 trillion of spending that's going to happen. But some of those are over time, so it doesn't affect the initial year of that deficit. So we've got a lot more time before all this money spending is going to go out the door, given how much they passed. And so if you look at even the Congressional Budget Office, which historically does a poor job of forecasting what's going to happen to the economy, they use a lot of static analysis and things of that nature. And some of these trade-offs that just don't exist, like the Phillips curve with the unemployment rate and inflation, these have been debunked for many years, kind of like Keynesian economics, but yet they still continue to use these sort of models. And so I think we're going to continue to see deficits, even like I was going to say, even the CBO says we're going to have $1 trillion deficits for the foreseeable future over the next decade. So I think it's going to be even worse than that, given that that's kind of a rosy scenario. And especially if we can't get spending under control, we've got to get spending under control. So people having jobs, lowest unemployment rate in 50 years is what Biden said, right? Well, the unemployment rate is down to about 3.4%, is the lowest, is the latest number for January of 2023. But look, a lot of people have dropped out of the labor force. The labor force isn't back to where it was before. The prime age, 25 to 54-year-olds, those are almost back, but there's also come down some. And the employment rate for those individuals is also down some as well from where we were in February of 2020 before the shutdowns. And so if you have people dropping out of the labor force, that also reduces the unemployment level, that numerator. And so that brings down your unemployment rate. And the other thing is, a lot of people are just not even looking for work. That's my point here in my tweet that I made, was that we have a lot of welfare without work. A lot of the safety nets, requirements of eligibility and working and everything else have been suspended during this time, during the national emergency declaration, which is supposed to end in May. We'll see if that actually happens, but May of 2023, it's supposed to end. And a lot of these safety net expansions, suspensions of the rules will hopefully go back into place, because there needs to be incentives for people to go back to work, not by paying people more tax breaks, but by getting government out of the way. And right now, government's been intruding too much and incentivizing people to stay home and not work. And so when that happens, that reduces the amount of productive capacity of the economy. And more importantly, it reduces the purpose, the dignity that comes with work for individuals across this great country. And I'm hopeful that will be overturned soon, because this is not a good situation. That was my next key point, many not in the labor force. And so that all goes together. And then, the numbers show that savings rate is near historic lows. It's around 3%, which is historically very low. So people, during the shutdown recession, you had a time when savings rates soared. I think it went up to like 33% at one time, as everybody was getting these tax rebate checks, which we all have to pay back in some way, either through higher taxes or inflation, is really what we're seeing right now. But they just saved a lot of that money. They couldn't go out. A lot of places were closed, so they saved a lot of that money. Well, now they've been going through a lot of those savings, and it's going down pretty rapidly. And even lower income has held onto a lot of that savings as well, which is one reason why I think some people have stayed out of the labor force on the sidelines as they've been spending those dollars. Maybe they also moved in with their parents, or maybe the parents moved in with their kids. There's been a lot of changes over the last couple of years. There were also a lot of early retirements as people dropped out of the labor force. They're like, look, I lost my job, so let me go, and I don't want to look for another job right now. But the problem is that they're running through their savings at a faster rate because inflation is going up so high around them. And so that's really a big hit that they're taking there. So, look, State of the Union, I thought the state of our union is really weak right now. We're fragile. I think we're going to have a more severe recession in 2023, given the dynamics that I'm seeing of higher interest rates. The Federal Reserve is going to have to reduce their money supply, which is really where they distort and manipulate the overall economy. We're not going to see big spending packages, I hope, because of the Republicans being in the House will be able to withstand a lot of what the Senate and the president want to do, the Democrats there. And so that means we're not going to have a lot of propping up of continual propping up of the economy from a lot of that, fiscal nonsense that's out there that's really just redistributing the overall economic pie, even though it can look like with the numbers that they use that you're boosting growth, given that, GDP is measured by consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. Well, government spending is just a redistribution of those dollars. It's not actually creating new wealth or new incomes in the economy. So I think it's not the best way to look at that overall. And so I think we've got a lot of things to look at in the economy. And that's one reason why my next point here is to look at responsible budgeting, which I think, the states are doing a better job of this. The federal government can't even pass a budget. They have to continue to pass these ongoing resolutions. They had an omnibus of what was it, $1.7 trillion, just massive amounts of omnibus bills that are being passed to keep the government open for a while. Now they're running up against the debt limit, debt ceiling, and we're at $31.4 trillion now in national debt. Just a massive amount. And some analysis that I've done here recently is during the Obama years, Trump years, and now the Biden years, 2/3 of that $30 trillion has been added to the national debt. So 20 of the $31.4 trillion has been added just during these last three presidencies. And this has been both Democrats and Republicans as president, Democrats and Republicans as majority in the House and the Senate. So this is really a Democrat and Republican problem. This is not just one party or the other. And I think both parties of these major parties that are out there really need to focus on spending less so they can rein in these deficits and debt, because I really feel like that is the biggest risk to America is our debt situation, our overspending situation. Yes, there are risks going on with China, but we can't afford to do something with China or Russia or other countries if we can't get control of our own spending and deficit issues here in America. It's always important to look internally, just like we talked about with trade, is lowering the cost of doing business, lowering the cost of government spending and running government and making it more efficient here in the United States. And I think the best way to look at that is what the states are doing. Places like Texas and Florida, Tennessee and others that are out there, I think are doing a much better job. And Iowa, by the way, they've been doing a great job as well. And this is a lot of my work. What I've been doing over the years is responsible budgeting. I did the conservative Texas budget. I've been working with a lot of other state think tanks on responsible budgeting, or what some have called sustainable budgeting. But this is so important because it allows for the private sector to really flourish, to where the productivity is happening in the private sector. And every dollar, right, if you're more productive in the private sector, at the margin, all those dollars should be staying in the private sector. And unfortunately, we have a situation where government likes to get its greedy hands on our money and spend it in places where they shouldn't be. And then that grows government, crowds out the private sector, and makes us poorer in the process. And so, I've been working with a lot of states on this in Alaska, the Alaska Policy Forum, been working some with the Independence Institute in Colorado, the James Madison Institute in Florida, the Iowans for Tax Relief Foundation in Iowa, the Kansas Policy Institute in Kansas, Pelican Institute in Louisiana, Mackinac Center in Michigan, Mississippi Center for Public Policy in Mississippi, the Frontier Institute in Montana, and the South Carolina Policy Council in South Carolina, and the Beacon Center in Tennessee, and the Texas Public Policy Foundation in Texas. I'm also going to be working some with the Americans for Tax Reform. We're looking at sustainable budgeting across all 50 states. That's my dream, is that we could do this across the board so we can get strong spending limits in place that cover as much of the budget as possible. At least all state funds would be great. All funds is really the footprint of government, but let's get somewhere started first. Let's use population growth and inflation as the key metric. So it's a good measure of the average taxpayer's ability to pay for government. I don't care as much about the appropriators of what their costs are, but how much is coming out of the productive private sector. And you want a high vote margin of a 3/5 or 2/3 majority vote in order to exceed the limit. I think that's going to be really important. And what we can do then is show that these states can do it, the federal government can do it as well, get these stronger spending limits in place. If not, just have it at least be implicitly done by these individual think tanks to hopefully set the stage for what the maximum threshold should be, and then ultimately get done at the federal level. So I think those are all going to be really important. And finally, my third point here is dealing with inflation and the labor market. We had a pretty robust labor report that came out earlier this month in February. 517,000 total non-farm jobs were added. That employment rate changed, went down a little bit to 3.4%. So it looked really robust. There was even a pretty good improvement in the household survey, which I think is important to look at as well. But a lot of this was based on the revisions that were made within their annual revisions and updates that they make to their modeling of the seasonal adjustments, for example, and the population estimates. And those seasonal adjustments and population estimates changed a lot of the dynamics that were in the labor market, at least with the way the data is calculated. And so I'm not so sure that I kind of take this with a grain of salt with this 517,000 jobs, because it just doesn't seem to match the reality of what we're hearing as many businesses are cutting workers across the economy. That's not indicated by this. You see slowdowns in a lot of the small businesses as interest rates have gone up, and those zombie firms who are just rolling over debt are having to fail because they can't afford the debt anymore with higher interest rates. And so I really took this with a grain of salt, and I'm thinking that we're going to see some more slowing down of the labor market moving forward, as I feel like we've been in a recession for a while. When you look at GDP growth being so slow and over the entire year of last year, and some of the other economic indicators that are out there, I just don't see where this is really matching reality. I think it was more of a function of the adjustments that were made, but we'll see. We'll see how it goes. I could be wrong on this. And then the inflation numbers that came out today for the consumer price index, a basket of goods and services paid by the average urban household is what it's supposed to be considered. The year over year number, so looking at from January 2022 to January 2023, the all items was up 6.4%. So slightly down from the 6.5% in the previous month. But look, for month over month from December to January, it was up 0.5%. So it's still growing at a rapid rate. That was the highest since October of 2022. Then you've got to go even further back till we had it that hot for 1 month. You also you exclude food and energy, that the items that tend to be more volatile on their prices, although we all spend money on those things, right? They're kind of a necessity. But if you exclude food and energy, look at the core inflation was up 5.6%, and it was up 0.4% just month over month. And so again, there is a lot of heat underlying the inflationary pressures that are out there. And the way that I look at this is the Federal Reserve's balance sheet hasn't really come down much. It peaked back in April of 2022. It's down about 6% since then, but it's still at about $8.5 trillion. Right, it's more than double where it was around $4 trillion before the shutdown recession, and so there's a long way to go for their balance sheet, which I truly believe is the way they manipulate the economy. Yes, they have a target interest rate, the federal funds rate, which is currently at a range from 4.5% to 4.75%, but that's one way that changes the orders of production throughout the economy. But whenever you're artificially putting money and increasing demand throughout the marketplace with dollars and reserves from their balance sheet, that's really the way that you're going to see a lot of the manipulation happen. And I really want to see that come down before we're going to get any sort of benefits of lower inflation in the economy. And ultimately, we might need to have some deflation. With as high and as fast as all these dollars, the prices that went up around us, we might need to see some deflation. Because look, year over year, food is up 10.1%. Food at home, 11.3%. Your fuel oil is up 27.7% year over year. Transportation services up 14.6%. Utility, gas service, 26.7%. These are massive increases over a very short period of time, which have been persistent inflation. Like I've been saying the entire time, it's not transitory inflation. And it's not going to soon go away if we don't have less government spending. Responsible budgets is so important. Running less deficit because then having less deficits will give the Federal Reserve less fuel to buy those treasuries, put more money in the economy, put more cash in that artificially creates demand compared to what is done in the productive private sector. So all that said, State of the Union, weak, right? We need more responsible budgeting. We need that revolution to continue, going all the way up from the states up to the federal level and local governments as well. That's the second one. And number three, we need to look at these reports with a grain of salt, because even the CPI numbers have a lot of seasonal adjustments that were added to it. So we'll see if that changes up in the coming months. But the labor market did as well. So we've got a lot to look at and observe in the coming months. Again, thank you for joining me here today. It's always a pleasure to have you here with me on the Let People Prosper show. Please share it with your friends and family, and give us a rating, right? Give me a rating. Hopefully a 5-star rating would be great, as I'm trying to continue to expand the reach of the Let People Prosper show. And the great things we're trying to do is to unleash economic potential for individuals so that they can meet their unique needs and satisfy their desires, right? And for themselves and their family. And that comes through free markets. Free market capitalism is the best path to prosperity. And so I hope that you'll continue to stick with me as we continue to have more guests on. Thank you again for joining me. Let people prosper.